What happens when arrogance and power collide with a secret, hidden in plain sight in the heart of New York City, inside one of its most exclusive restaurants, a titan of industry, a man who could buy and sell entire countries, decided to amuse his friends by mocking a simple waitress. He spoke in a language he believed was his secret shield, German. He called her pathetic, slow, invisible. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He had no idea who he was talking to, and he had no idea that his quiet, unassuming waitress understood every single word. What she did next didn't just silence him. It threatened to bring his entire empire crashing down. The air in Viridian, one of Manhattan's most ostentatious temples of haute cuisine, was thick with the scent of money and truffle oil. It was a place where conversations were held in hushed tones, but the deals whispered across the starched white tablecloths could shift global markets. For Elara Vance, the air tasted of exhaustion and deferred dreams. At 24, Elara moved with a practiced grace that belied the ache in her feet and the weight on her soul. Her uniform, a crisp black dress shirt, a long white apron, tied just so, was a costume she wore every night, a shield that hid the woman she was supposed to be. 5 years ago, she had been the star pupil in Columbia University's International Business Program, a scholarship kid with a savant-like gift for languages, fluent in English, German, and Mandarin. Her thesis on ethical corporate acquisitions was already being lauded by her professors. She had a future mapped out in boardrooms, not dining rooms. Then her father's diagnosis came, a rare, aggressive form of cancer that devoured their savings, their home, and finally her future. Elara dropped out of school to become his caregiver, and after he passed, she was left with a mountain of medical debt and a hollowed-out heart. So she took the first job she could get that paid the bills. Serving food to the very people she once expected to count among her peers was a daily lesson in humility and sometimes humiliation. Tonight was no different. She balanced a heavy tray, laden with crystal water glasses, her smile a carefully constructed mask of polite indifference. Her section was filling up, and her gaze scanned the room, cataloguing the needs of her tables. That's when she saw him enter. Klaus Richter. Even if you didn't know the name, you knew the type. He didn't walk into a room. He conquered it. Tall, with severe silver-streaked hair swept back from a perpetually tanned forehead, he wore a custom-tailored Brioni suit that probably cost more than Elara's annual income. He was the CEO and founder of Richter Global Innovations RGI, a ruthless corporate raider disguised as a tech visionary. His face was a regular feature in the Wall Street Journal, and Forbes usually next to a headline about another hostile takeover. Flanking him were 2 younger men in similarly expensive suits, Marcus Thorne and Julian Croft. They radiated the nervous energy of hyenas, circling a lion eager for scraps of approval. They laughed too loudly at his non-jokes and practically tripped over themselves to pull out his chair. Table for Richter, Klaus announced to the maître d', not as a request, but as a declaration. He didn't have a reservation. He didn't need one. The maître d', a man who prided himself on his unflappable composure, faltered for a moment before leading them to the best table in the house, a secluded corner booth with a panoramic view of the city lights. It was in Elara's section. A familiar knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She had served men like Klaus Richter before. They were a special breed of difficult. They saw service staff not as people, but as functions extensions of the furniture. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and approached the table. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Viridian. My name is Elara, and I'll be your server tonight. May I start you with some water?" Klaus didn't even look at her. He was busy scrolling through his phone, one eyebrow arched in annoyance. Marcus, the one on his right, answered for him. "Still and a bottle of the 98 Chateau Margaux, and be quick about it." "Of course," Elara said, her voice even. As she turned to leave, she heard Klaus mutter to his companions, his voice a low, dismissive growl. He didn't bother to lower it. "The service gets slower every time I come here." Elara's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. It was just the opening salvo. She knew the night would be long. She retrieved the water and the wine, presenting the vintage bottle to Marcus, as Klaus remained engrossed in his phone. She performed the ritual with precision, uncorking, offering the cork, pouring a small taste. Everything by the book. All the while she felt Klaus Richter's unseen judgment pressing down on her. It was a suffocating pressure, the casual disdain of a man who believed the world was his personal plaything, and everyone in it was either a tool or an obstacle. Elara pasted on her professional smile and prepared for the onslaught. She had no idea that tonight the game would be played in a language she knew all too well, and the stakes would be far higher than a generous tip. The first hour of the dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. Klaus Richter communicated through his underlings, sending back a perfectly cooked steak because it was plated with a distinct lack of imagination, and complaining that the ambient light was an affront to ocular comfort. Each complaint was delivered via Marcus or Julian, while Klaus himself maintained an air of regal boredom, as if the entire experience was beneath him. Elara handled each issue with robotic efficiency. She replaced the steak. She had the lighting adjusted. Her face remained a placid mask, but inside a storm was brewing. It was the calculated cruelty of it that got to her the way he refused to acknowledge her existence, treating her as a non-entity. A ghost who refilled his water glass and cleared his plates. After the main course was served to his satisfaction, this time, apparently the real conversation at the table began. The tone shifted. Klaus leaned forward, finally putting his phone away. He switched from English to German. The sudden shift in language was like a key, turning in a lock inside Elara's mind. German was the language of her maternal grandmother, a kind woman from Berlin who had filled her childhood with fairy tales and soft melodic words. It was the language she had perfected at Columbia, reading Goethe and financial reports with equal fluency. It was a part of her soul. Klaus, however, used it as a weapon of exclusion. He assumed it was a private channel, a corporate code that rendered them invisible to the prying ears of the common folk. He, Marcus, and Julian all spoke it fluently, their conversation a seamless flow of harsh, guttural consonants. At first, the comments were about the restaurant. Then they turned to her. As Elara approached to refill their wine glasses, Klaus gestured dismissively in her direction with his glass, speaking to Julian. "Schau sie dir an, das arme Ding," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look at her, the poor thing, drifting through life without a purpose." Elara's hand didn't tremble. Her expression didn't flicker. She continued pouring the deep red liquid into his glass, the wine swirling, catching the light. Inside her blood ran cold. Julian chuckled obsequiously. "Ja, Chef. Man fragt sich, was bei solchen Leuten im Kopf vorgeht." "Yes, boss. One wonders what goes on in the minds of people like that." The conversation continued as she moved around the table. "Wahrscheinlich nicht viel," Klaus added, taking a loud sip of his wine. "Sie hat wahrscheinlich nicht 2 Gehirnzellen zum Aneinanderreiben, nur genug Teller von A nach B zu tragen." "Probably not much. She probably doesn't have 2 brain cells to rub together. Just enough to carry plates from A to B." Marcus joined in. "Ihre Stiefel sehen aus, als hätten sie schon bessere Tage gesehen, genau wie ihre Zukunft. Her boots look like they've seen better days, just like her future." They all laughed. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh, but a quiet, conspiratorial snicker, the sound of privileged men confirming their own superiority at the expense of someone they considered less than human. Elara felt a hot surge of rage so intense it almost made her dizzy. Every word was a branding iron, searing her pride. They weren't just insulting a waitress, they were mocking the memory of her father, the sacrifices she'd made, the dreams she'd been forced to put on hold. They were spitting on her entire existence from their gilded perch, and they didn't even have the decency to do it in a language she was supposed to understand. She retreated to the service station, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the counter. Her colleague, a cheerful, aspiring actress named Chloe, noticed her distress. "Everything okay, Elara, table 3? Giving you trouble, that guy looks like he eats kittens for breakfast." Elara forced a shaky breath. "They're just demanding." She couldn't tell Chloe the truth. How could she explain the violation of hearing herself so thoroughly dehumanized in a language that felt like home? How could she articulate the feeling of being dissected and discarded by men who didn't even see her as a person? Her training, her every instinct, told her to let it go. Endure it. The shift would be over in a few hours. She would get her meager share of the tip, go home to her tiny apartment, and forget Klaus Richter ever existed. That was the smart play. That was the safe play. But as she picked up the silver dessert menus, something inside her shifted. It was the memory of her father, a proud man who worked as a master carpenter his entire life. He had always told her, "Your circumstances don't define your character, Elara. Only your actions do." She walked back to the table, her spine a little straighter, her steps more deliberate. The men were still laughing, still speaking German. She placed the menus on the table, her movements fluid and silent. Klaus glanced at her, then back at his associates. "Seht ihr wie ein Automat. Man drückt einen Knopf und sie bringt das nächste Menü. See like an automaton. You press a button and she brings the next menu." The insult hung in the air thick and vile. Elara met his gaze for a fraction of a second. His eyes were cold grey and utterly empty of empathy. In that moment, she made a decision. She would not just endure, she would listen. She would remember every single word. The night was far from over. After ordering dessert with the same air of condescension, the men's conversation took a more serious turn. Believing themselves to be cocooned in the impenetrable privacy of the German language, they began to discuss business. And Elara, as she moved silently in the periphery, clearing plates and refilling water glasses, became an invisible witness to a corporate conspiracy. So Marcus, the final phase of Project Nightingale, commences Monday. Klaus began his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial hush. The casual cruelty was gone, replaced by a chillingly precise, predatory focus. Project Nightingale. The name sounded innocent, almost beautiful. But the details Elara overheard were anything but. Marcus leaned in his sycophantic demeanor, shifting into that of a loyal lieutenant. "Ja, Klaus, the media plants are all in place. The analyst reports, predicting a catastrophic Q4 for Ethelgard Tech, will drop at 9:01 a.m., just after the opening bell." Ethelgard Tech. The name jolted Elara like an electric shock. She almost dropped the dessert fork she was placing beside Julian's plate. Ethelgard Tech wasn't just some random company to her. It was a legend in her business ethics class at Columbia. Founded by the brilliant but aging innovator, Arthur Sterling Ethelgard was known for its groundbreaking green energy patents and its famously ethical, employee-first corporate culture. It was the antithesis of a company like RGI. Her father, a man who believed in building things that lasted, had deeply admired Arthur Sterling and his work. He'd once clipped a magazine article about Sterling, taping it to his workshop wall. "This man builds for the future," he'd said. Now Klaus Richter was talking about destroying it. "Good," Klaus grunted, cutting into his chocolate lava cake. "The short-selling cascade should begin by noon. The panic will be glorious. Their shareholders are sheep. They will scatter at the first sight of wolves." Julian, the younger of the two, chimed in, eager to prove his worth. "And the internal memo we leaked about their supposed patent fraud. Our sources confirm it's already circulating among their senior engineers. The internal chaos will paralyze their response." Ilara felt sick. This wasn't just a hostile takeover. This was a calculated assassination of a good company built on lies and market manipulation. They were manufacturing a crisis to drive the stock price into the ground, allowing RGI to swoop in and buy it for pennies on the dollar. It was brutal, unethical, and almost certainly illegal. Klaus took a sip of his espresso, a predatory gleam in his eye. "The final nail in the coffin will be the board meeting. When we present our offer on Wednesday, Sterling's board members whose portfolios we have been assisting will have no choice but to see our offer as a merciful rescue. They will pressure him to sell. He's an old fool, sentimental. He still thinks business is about honor." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound devoid of humor. "Ehre ist eine Währung für Bettler. Honor is a currency for beggars." The phrase struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. It was a complete repudiation of everything her father had stood for, everything Arthur Sterling had built. In that moment, Klaus Richter ceased to be just an arrogant customer. He became the embodiment of the corporate greed that had crushed her family, the faceless force that valued profit over people, power over principle. She could feel the information buzzing under her skin, a toxic current of whispered words and dark intentions. Project Nightingale, media plants, short-selling cascade, leaked memos, compromised board members. It was a complete blueprint for a corporate crime. Her mind raced the analytical skills she hadn't used in years, roaring back to life. She remembered the case studies, the SEC regulations on market manipulation, the very laws Richter was gleefully planning to break. The anger that had been simmering within her was now forged into something cold, hard, and sharp purpose. This was bigger than a few insults. This was about justice. It was about defending the memory of her father and the legacy of a good man he admired. She had been called a ghost, an automaton, a non-entity. But ghosts can haunt, automatons can carry out unexpected directives, and a non-entity has the perfect cover. As she cleared their dessert plates, her hands were steady, her movements deliberate. She made eye contact with no one playing her part as the invisible waitress to perfection. Klaus and his cronies paid her no mind, lost in their triumphant plotting, finalizing the last details of their corporate slaughter. They were so confident in their secret language, so secure in their power, that they never once looked at the person standing 3 feet away from them. They never saw the spark of defiance ignite in the eyes of the poor thing who was about to become their worst nightmare. The meal was over. The last of the espresso cups had been cleared, the crumbs swept away from the pristine white linen. All that remained was the bill. For Ilara, this was usually the final, often disappointing act of a long performance. It was the moment she would find out if her diligent service and tolerance for abuse would be rewarded with a respectable tip or the ultimate insult of being stiffed. Tonight, however, the bill felt different. It felt like a countdown. She printed the check, slipped it into the sleek black leather folder, and walked the final few yards to their table. The 3 men were laughing now, basking in the afterglow of their successful plotting. They were talking about what they would do with Ethelgard's patents once the company was gutted and absorbed into the RGI machine. Elara placed the folder discreetly on the table next to Klaus. He ignored it, as he had ignored her all evening. He was in the middle of a story, his voice booming with self-importance as he switched back to English, presumably for the benefit of any nearby eavesdroppers he might want to impress. And so I told the board, if you want to make an omelette, you have to be willing to break a few eggs. Some people are just eggs. He looked pointedly around the restaurant, his gaze sweeping over the staff, including Elara, as if they were all eggs waiting to be broken for his grand culinary ambitions. Marcus and Julian roared with appreciative laughter. Klaus picked up the leather folder, not even opening it. He pulled a black, ridiculously exclusive credit card from his wallet and tucked it inside, holding the folder out in Elara's direction without looking at her. As she reached to take it, he turned to Julian and, reverting to German for one final parting shot, delivered the insult that would change everything. Gib ihr ein großzügiges Trinkgeld. Julian, he said, his voice dripping with condescending mockery. $20. Das ist wahrscheinlich mehr, als ihr Vater in einer ganzen Woche verdient hat. Sie kann sich davon ein paar neue Stiefel und vielleicht einen Funken Selbstachtung kaufen. Give her a generous tip, Julian. $20. That's probably more than her father earned in a whole week. She can buy herself some new boots and maybe a spark of self-respect with it. Time seemed to slow down. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of distant conversations, the hum of the city outside, it all faded into a dull roar. The mention of her father, the man who had worked himself to the bone with his calloused, capable hands, the man whose honor Klaus had just called a currency for beggars, it was a line too far. The carefully constructed dam of her professionalism finally broke, and years of suppressed grief, anger, and injustice came rushing out. She didn't take the folder. Her hand, which had been reaching for it, simply stopped in mid-air. Klaus frowned, annoyed at the delay. He finally turned his head to look at her, his eyes filled with impatience. "Well, are you going to stand there all night?" he snapped in English. Elara met his gaze. Her own eyes, which had been downcast and deferential all evening, were now blazing with a cold, clear fire. She stood up to her full height, and for the first time, she spoke to him, not as a waitress, but as an equal. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a shard of glass, and she spoke in flawless academic, High German. "Ich glaube nicht, dass $20 ausreichen werden, Herr Richter," she said. "I don't think $20 will be sufficient, Mr. Richter." The silence that followed was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical entity, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the booth. The smug, self-satisfied expressions on the faces of Klaus, Marcus, and Julian froze, cracking like porcelain. Klaus Richter's face went slack with shock. His jaw, which had been set in a permanent sneer, hung slightly open. His eyes, which had looked through her all night, were now locked on her wide with disbelief and a dawning, horrified realization. He looked as though a piece of furniture had just recited Shakespeare. Marcus and Julian exchanged panicked glances, their faces draining of all color. They looked like schoolboys caught cheating by the headmaster. Elara continued her German precise, her tone unwavering. "Und was meinen Vater betrifft. And as for my father." She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on them. Hat vielleicht nicht in einer Woche so viel verdient, wie Sie für eine Flasche Wein ausgeben. Aber hat sein Leben mit einer Ehre geführt, die Sie in 1000 Lebensjahren niemals verstehen würden. Eine Ehre, die, wie Sie so treffend bemerkten, keine Währung für Sie ist. He may not have earned in a week what you spent on a bottle of wine, but he lived his life with an honor you would never understand in 1,000 lifetimes. An honor that, as you so aptly pointed out, is not a currency for you. She stood there no longer, Ilara the waitress, but Ilara Vance, the woman they had mocked, the woman who had heard everything. The power dynamic in the most exclusive corner of one of New York's most exclusive restaurants had just been irrevocably, seismically altered. The billionaire CEO was frozen, and the waitress was about to expose everything. Klaus Richter's paralysis lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief eternity, Ilara saw a cascade of emotions flicker across his face, raw shock followed by a flash of fear, which was quickly masked by a surge of pure, undiluted rage. He was a king who had just been checked by a pawn, and his entire being recoiled at the indignity. He snatched the billfolder back, his knuckles white. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, reverting to the blunt instrument of English. His German, his secret shield, had been compromised. Ilara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was far more unnerving than any shout could be. "I am the person you and your colleagues have spent the last hour insulting," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I am the automaton who doesn't have 2 brain cells to rub together. I am the poor thing whose father you just defiled." Marcus and Julian shrank back in their seats, looking anywhere but at Klaus or Ilara. They were rats on a sinking ship, and the captain was taking on water fast. "You're fired!" Klaus spat his face, turning a blotchy red. He waved a hand dismissively. "Get out of my sight. I'll have your job." "You probably will," Ilara conceded, with a small, chillingly calm nod. "But a lost job is the least of your concerns tonight, Mr. Richter." She leaned forward slightly, not in a gesture of subservience, but of confidentiality, mimicking the way he had leaned in to discuss his dark plans. Her voice dropped, but it lost none of its steely edge. "Let's talk about Project Nightingale," she said. The name spoken aloud in this context had the effect of a grenade dropped on the table. Klaus flinched, as if physically struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, greyish pallor. Ilara pressed her advantage, her mind a razor-sharp repository of every word they had spoken. She began to dismantle him piece by piece, using his own words, his own plans against him. A fascinating strategy. She began her tone now resembling that of a university lecturer dissecting a case study. Coordinated media plants to trigger a panic sell-off of Ethelgard tech stock. A manufactured internal memo about patent fraud to sow chaos and paralyze their leadership, all timed to create a short-selling cascade that will artificially deflate their market value by, I would estimate, 60 to 70%. She paused, looking directly into Klaus's terrified eyes. "That's not just a hostile takeover, Mr. Richter. That's a clear violation of SEC Rule 10b-5, prohibiting manipulative and deceptive devices in the stock market. I believe the legal term for it is securities fraud. The prison sentences for that are quite substantial, I hear." Julian Croft made a small, strangled sound in the back of his throat. Klaus tried to regain control, puffing out his chest. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're a waitress. You've been listening to a private conversation." "A private conversation you had at full volume in a public place," Ilara corrected him smoothly. "And as for not knowing what I'm talking about, I wrote my thesis at Columbia on the legal precedents for prosecuting market manipulation in hostile acquisitions, SEC verse. Texas Gulf Sulfur is a particularly relevant case. You might want to have your lawyers look it up." The mention of Columbia, of a thesis of specific legal cases, shattered the last of his composure. He was no longer dealing with a simple waitress. He was facing someone who understood his world, his language, and the criminality of his actions. At that moment, the restaurant manager, a perpetually stressed man named Mr. Dubois, hurried over. He had likely been summoned by the palpable tension radiating from the table. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Richter?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously between the furious billionaire and the impossibly calm waitress. "Yes, there is a problem," Klaus boomed, finding his voice again, now that a perceived authority figure had arrived. This employee of yours is harassing me and my guests. She is delusional. I want her removed." "Now." Mr. Dubois turned to Elara, his face a mask of managerial panic. "Elara, what is going on?" "Go to the back, immediately." Elara stood her ground. "Mr. Richter is accusing me of being delusional," she said to her manager, though her eyes never left Klaus. "Perhaps he can explain why the name Arthur Sterling makes him so uncomfortable." She let the name of Ethelgard's founder hang in the air, or why he and his associates have been discussing how to bribe and pressure Mr. Sterling's board members into betraying him. I believe you called them sheep, Mr. Richter, and you referred to Mr. Sterling as an old fool who believes in honor. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing his arrogance and exposing the rotten core beneath. The story was now complete, laid bare for anyone to hear. The insults, the plot, the motive, the victims, everything. "That's it, I'm calling security," Mr. Dubois sputtered, reaching for his phone. "That won't be necessary," a new voice said. The voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. It came from a nearby table, where an elderly gentleman, impeccably dressed in a simple tweed jacket, had been dining alone. He had been watching the entire exchange with a calm, observant gaze. He slowly rose to his feet, placing his napkin on the table, and walked towards them. He was not a physically imposing man, but as he approached, a palpable aura of dignity and power radiated from him. Klaus Richter's eyes widened in utter horror. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost. The old man stopped beside Elara, offering her a small, appreciative smile before turning his piercing blue eyes on the three men in the booth. "Mr. Richter," he said, his voice as steady as ancient rock. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. My name is Arthur Sterling." The name dropped into the suffocating atmosphere of the standoff like a meteor. Mr. Dubois froze his hand, hovering over his phone. Marcus and Julian looked as though they might actually faint. And Klaus Richter, the titan of industry, the corporate predator, looked utterly and completely broken. It was the face of a man watching his entire world crumble to dust in real time. Arthur Sterling, the old fool, the man whose life's work they had been gleefully planning to dismantle, stood before them, a living testament to their hubris. He surveyed the scene with a calm that was more terrifying than any rage. His gaze lingered for a moment on Klaus, then on his two terrified associates. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound and weary disappointment. "I came here tonight to have a quiet dinner and reflect on a difficult week." Sterling began, his voice resonating with quiet power. "My company, you see, has been under a rather vicious and inexplicable attack. Rumors, false reports, internal dissent. It was all very coordinated." He looked directly at Klaus. "I couldn't understand who would orchestrate such a thing. Who would want to destroy a company that has dedicated itself to creating clean energy and treating its employees with respect? But I suppose I have my answer now." He then turned his attention to Elara, and the hardness in his expression softened into one of genuine admiration. "I also heard how you were treated by these gentlemen. I must apologize. I should have intervened sooner. But I confess I was utterly captivated by your composure and your courage." Elara, who had been running on pure adrenaline, felt a tremor run through her. To be seen to be validated by this man, the very man her father had so admired, it was overwhelming. Sterling continued his voice once again, firm as he addressed the table. "You see, Mr. Richter, you made several critical miscalculations tonight. The first and most obvious was underestimating this brilliant young woman." He gestured toward Ilara. "The second was assuming that your wealth could insulate you from decency and consequences. And the third," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "was believing that a secret spoken in German would be safe in a city like New York, a city built by immigrants, a city filled with people who carry the languages of their parents and grandparents in their hearts." He took a small digital audio recorder out of his jacket pocket and placed it on the table with a soft click. A small red light was blinking. "While my German is perhaps not as flawless as Miss Vance's," Sterling said, "it is more than sufficient. And this little device has a perfect memory for every detail of Project Nightingale. My lawyers, along with the Securities and Exchange Commission, will be fascinated to hear all about it." That was the final blow. The sight of the recorder, the mention of lawyers and the SEC, it was the sound of the guillotine blade dropping. Julian Croft actually whimpered. Klaus Richter finally moved. He lurched to his feet, his face a grotesque mask of fury and desperation. "This is entrapment. You can't... This is illegal," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Ilara and then at the recorder. "Is it as illegal as conspiring to defraud investors and manipulate the stock market, Mr. Richter?" Sterling asked with unnerving calm. "I think not. Now I suggest you and your associates leave. You have ruined my appetite, and you are no longer welcome in this establishment." It wasn't his establishment to say, but at that moment, no one, least of all Mr. Dubois, was going to contradict Arthur Sterling. Klaus stared at him, his chest heaving. For a moment, it looked like he might explode, or swing, or do something utterly irrational. But then he saw the faces of the other diners who were now openly staring. He saw the cold, unwavering gaze of Arthur Sterling, and he saw the quiet, triumphant dignity of Ilara Vance, the waitress who had brought him down. Defeated, he seemed to shrink. The powerful aura he had projected all night evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out, pathetic man. Without another word, he turned and stalked out of the restaurant. Marcus and Julian scrambled after him like frightened children, a wake of utter humiliation trailing behind them. The restaurant was silent for a moment, and then slowly a few of the other patrons began to applaud. It started with one table, then another, a soft rising tide of appreciation for the quiet waitress who had just felled a giant. Ilara felt a blush creep up her neck, a mixture of embarrassment and overwhelming relief. Arthur Sterling smiled warmly at her. "I believe, Miss Vance," he said, "that you and I have a great deal to talk about." In the immediate wake of Klaus Richter's humiliating exit, the dining room of Viridian seemed to hold its breath. The charged silence was broken not by the staff, but by the patrons. A man at a nearby table, a silver-haired investor Ilara recognized from the financial news, raised his wine glass in a silent toast to her. Then another table began to applaud, not a wild, boisterous ovation, but a ripple of soft, respectful clapping that spread through the room. It was an acknowledgement, a collective recognition of the quiet courage they had just witnessed. Ilara stood frozen, the sound washing over her. The adrenaline that had sharpened her mind and steadied her voice began to recede, leaving a profound tremor in its wake. Her legs felt weak, her hands shook slightly, and she had to consciously focus on taking a deep, steadying breath. It was over. The performance of a lifetime was over. She felt an overwhelming urge to both laugh and cry. Mr. Dubois, the manager, scurried over to her, his face a mess of conflicting emotions, awe, terror, and a desperate, fawning need to be on the right side of this new power dynamic. "Miss Vance Ilara," he began, his voice several octaves higher than usual. "Astounding. Truly, I had no idea. Please, my deepest apologies for my tone earlier. I was simply trying to de-escalate." He trailed off, realizing how foolish he sounded. "Please take the rest of the night off. With full pay, of course. Go home, rest. You've earned it." Before Ilara could respond, her friend Chloe rushed out from the service station, her eyes wide with disbelief and vicarious triumph. She threw her arms around Ilara in a fierce hug. "Oh my God, Ilara," she whispered, her voice choked with excitement. "You were incredible. It was like watching a superhero movie. You have to tell me everything." Ilara hugged her back tightly, the simple act of friendship, a grounding force in the surreal vortex of the last 10 minutes. "I will," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. Across the room, Arthur Sterling had quietly settled his own bill, leaving a tip that could likely cover a month's rent. He approached them, his presence commanding a respectful silence. He gave Mr. Dubois a nod that was both a greeting and a dismissal. The manager vanished instantly. "Miss Vance," Sterling said, his voice gentle. "When you are ready, I would be honored if you would allow me to walk with you for a moment. There is no rush." He then retreated to the restaurant's entrance, giving her the space to collect herself, a gesture of profound respect that felt more valuable than any apology. Ilara took a few minutes in the staff changing room. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The same tired eyes stared back, but something fundamental had shifted behind them. The mask of the deferential waitress was gone, replaced by a quiet strength she hadn't realized she still possessed. She slowly, deliberately untied the strings of her apron, the one stained with a tiny drop of Klaus Richter's expensive wine. It felt like shedding a skin. She folded it, left it on the bench, grabbed her worn coat and bag, said a final heartfelt goodbye to Chloe, and walked out of the restaurant's service entrance for the last time. She found Arthur Sterling waiting on the sidewalk, standing under the glow of a street lamp. He had dismissed his car, preferring the simple anonymity of the pavement. The city roared around them, a cacophony of sirens' horns, and the distant rumble of the subway. But in their small circle, there was a profound quiet. "Please," she said, her voice finding its strength again. "Call me Ilara." "Ilara, then," he said with a warm smile. "May I?" He gestured down the street, and they began to walk. For the first few blocks they moved in a comfortable silence. The city lights, which had for years represented a world of wealth and opportunity she was locked out of, now seemed to sparkle with promise. It was the same street, the same city, but she was seeing it through entirely new eyes. Finally, Sterling spoke, his tone thoughtful. "Your German is exceptional. Not just fluent, but nuanced. You have the precision of a scholar." "My grandmother was from Berlin," Ilara explained, the memory bringing a sad smile to her lips. "She taught me the language of fairy tales. Columbia taught me the language of financial reports." "Ah, Columbia," Sterling mused. "You mentioned a thesis on prosecuting market manipulation. It seems a rather prescient topic given tonight's events. What happened to that path, Ilara, if you don't mind my asking?" The question was direct, yet gentle. It wasn't an interrogation. It was an invitation. And for the first time in 5 years, Ilara felt safe enough to accept. She took a deep breath and began to tell him her story. She spoke of her scholarship, the thrill of her studies, the feeling that she had finally found her calling in the complex world of international business ethics. She described the intellectual challenges, the late nights in the library, the fierce pride she felt in her work. Then her voice softened as she spoke of her father. She described the man who was a master carpenter who could create beauty and permanence from a simple piece of wood, a man who measured his wealth in the sturdiness of his work and the love of his family. She explained the shock of the diagnosis, the bewildering maze of specialists and treatments, the hope that flickered and faded with each new test result. "The bills?" she said, her voice catching for a moment. "They were astronomical. We sold the house he built. We emptied our savings. My scholarship covered tuition, but not that. I started working 2 jobs while trying to keep up with my studies, but it wasn't enough. My father, he never wanted me to quit. He'd get angry when I talked about it. Your education is the one thing they can never take from you," he'd say. She paused, looking at the city lights blurring through the unshed tears in her eyes. "But in the end, I had to choose. I could finish my degree, or I could be with him. I could let him worry about the debt from his hospital bed, or I could try to ease his mind. It wasn't really a choice." She told him of the final months of reading his favorite books to him, of the quiet dignity with which he faced the end. And then the crushing weight of the debt that remained a monument to the battle they had lost. "Viridian was just a job," she finished quietly. "It paid the bills. I told myself it was temporary, but it's been 3 years. Sometimes you get so focused on surviving the day that you forget how to plan for a life." Sterling had listened without interruption, his full attention on her. When she finished, he led her to a small bench in a pocket park, an oasis of calm amidst the city's relentless energy. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said, his voice filled with sincere empathy. "My father was a watchmaker. He spent his life hunched over a tiny desk working with gears and springs too small to see. People told him to modernize, to build cheaper, faster. But he refused. He said, a man's legacy is the integrity of his work." It seems our fathers would have understood each other very well. He looked away for a moment, lost in thought. Klaus Richter and men like him, they don't build. They only know how to break things. They see a beautiful, intricate watch, and their only thought is to smash it and sell the gears for scrap. For years they've been circling Ethelgard. They see our ethical policies and our investment in our employees not as strengths, but as inefficiencies to be carved out and discarded. He turned back to her, his gaze intense and purposeful. Richter's attack, as vile as it was, exposed a critical vulnerability in my company. I am, as he so helpfully pointed out, an old fool who believes in honor. I need a new generation of leadership. I need people who are not just smart, but wise. Not just ambitious, but principled. People who can see the wolves at the door before they start to howl. He leaned forward slightly. "Elara, what you did tonight was not just an act of personal defiance. It was the most brilliant and effective piece of counterintelligence I have ever witnessed. In 20 minutes, you identified a threat, analyzed its methodology, articulated the legal ramifications, and neutralized it completely. You saved my company, its shareholders, and the livelihoods of my 5,000 employees." He let that sink in before he continued. "I have an opening in my senior executive team, head of a new division, in fact, corporate strategy and threat analysis. It requires a deep understanding of international markets fluency in multiple languages for global intelligence gathering, and an unimpeachable moral compass to navigate the ethical minefields of modern business. The position reports directly to me." Elara's heart was pounding. This couldn't be real. "Mr. Sterling, I don't know what to say. I'm a waitress." "No, He corrected her gently but firmly. You were a waitress. That was your job, not your identity. Your identity is a brilliant strategic thinker with a first-class education and a core of steel. I am not offering you this job out of pity or charity. Charity would be writing you a check for your troubles. This is not charity. This is a recruitment. I would be the worst kind of fool to witness your capabilities firsthand and then let you walk away. I need you, Elara. Ethelgard needs you. The sincerity in his voice was absolute. He wasn't saving her. He was hiring her. He was investing in her. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally did, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. They were tears of grief for all she had lost, but also tears of overwhelming, incandescent hope for all that she had just found. Yes, she whispered the single word, carrying the weight of 1,000 deferred dreams. Yes, I accept. The following week was a blur of surreal change. Her final day at Viridian was quiet. She said her goodbyes, packed her few belongings from her locker, and left her folded apron on the bench, a final symbolic shedding of her old life. With an advance on her salary from Ethelgard, she paid off the last, most stubborn of her father's medical debts. The feeling of liberation was so profound, it left her lightheaded. On a crisp autumn morning, she stood before the Ethelgard Tower. It was nothing like the stuffy old-world buildings of the financial district. It was a spear of glass and recycled steel covered in panels that glittered in the sun, a testament to the clean energy it championed. She walked into the lobby not with the hesitant steps of a waitress, but with the confident stride of a woman who knew her worth. The lobby was an atrium filled with natural light-living walls of green plants and the quiet hum of innovation. She gave her name to the receptionist, and a moment later, a security card was printed with her photo and name, Elara Vance, head of corporate strategy. She took the silent high-speed elevator to the top floor. The doors opened not to a secretary's desk, but to a bright, open-plan office with a breathtaking view of the city. Arthur Sterling was there, standing by the window waiting for her. He turned a broad, genuine smile on his face. Elara, he said, extending his hand. Welcome to Ethelgard. Your office is this way. We have a world to build. As she shook his hand, she looked out at the sprawling city below. It was no longer a landscape of impossible heights and locked doors. It was just a view, her view, and she was finally ready to begin her work. Elara's story is a powerful reminder that our current circumstances never define our true worth. A person's value isn't determined by the uniform they wear or the job they do, but by the content of their character and the strength of their spirit. Klaus Richter saw only a waitress. He was blind to the brilliant, resilient woman standing before him, and that blindness was his downfall. This story shows us that integrity, knowledge, and courage are weapons that even the most powerful bullies cannot withstand. It's a testament to the idea that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should be listening to the most. If this story of justice and vindication resonated with you, if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and empower. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for listening.